Welcome to Clear Conversations, Entrepreneurial Legacies with your host, John Sleeting, an executive partner for Clearwater Capital Partners. Join John and his guests on this exclusive journey behind the scenes of extraordinary entrepreneurial families. In this series, we will dive deep into the stories of John's guests, who generously unveil the paths they've walked, the challenges they've overcome, and the wisdom they've gained along the way. Throughout these conversations, we explore their achievements beyond mere recognition, disclosing the distinctive perspectives that have shaped their entrepreneurial journeys. We hope you enjoy.
Welcome to the Clear Conversations series, Entrepreneurial Legacies. Today I'm joined by Joe Pringle. Joe and I have known each other for a little over 6 years. He and his wife, Tammy, have been married for 43 years. They have 4 adult children, all married, and 9 grandchildren. They are a fantastic family, and as my wife, and I'll repeat it again later, I'm sure, when we grow up, we want to be like Joe and Tammy. They're fantastic story that stretches back now 400 years, which is where we'll start. We'll move through the early years quite quickly to get into Joe's heart and his head about family business, philanthropy, giving, creating memories, creating stories, engaging the future generations to build the legacy that he and his family want to approach. He's got his undergraduate degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has his MBA from the University of Northwestern, and he's also been in multiple businesses that he's bought and sold and how he's approached his life. So he is a wealth of resource, a wealth of wisdom in how to view family and how to approach business. So please join me in welcoming Joe, and we're going to dig in. So Joe, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. I've said it for multiple years. We've known each other now for over 6 years, and you sharing your story, your family story, the lessons learned, the challenges, the cautionary tales, the inspiration that is part of your family story is really an exciting time for us getting together. But we have a little bit of ground to cover, and so we're going to start 400 years ago. In the early 1620s, your family traveled over from Wales, immigrated into the, not even the United States at that point in time, right after the Mayflower, if I've got my timeline right, and was in north of Boston for a couple hundred years, and then migrated towards the Chicago area in the mid-1800s. Can you pick it up from there and provide a little bit more context of your family after they came into Chicago? Because if I understand correctly, that's where you start thinking about the generational businesses that were created here in the Midwest. Yeah.
So it was my mother's side of the family that was in the particular business that they came over to start in the Chicago area. And it was in the 1860s that they started a company called Chicago Rawhide. And they originally made buggy whips, was one of the first things they made, as well as industrial belting and a variety of other things along those lines. And that was where the business kind of was originally founded.
And so from buggy whips, right, we don't drive buggies anymore. The world was changing. How did they evolve? Because they didn't see themselves actually in the rawhide business. The way you were sharing it before with me is they looked at themselves as being in the engineering business.
Yeah, and fortunately it morphed that way. I mean, there's so many businesses that are kind of a one-trick pony, and then they end up being obsolete. Fortunately, Henry Ford actually came to them with an idea. He had just come out with his first car, and when you make a car and you have an axle, you have to be able to have the grease be able to be held onto that axle. And they didn't have rubber or anything along those lines to be able to keep the grease in there. And so they, and the wear on the shaft, the rubber wouldn't work. So they came up with rawhide to use that. And that was kind of the main thing that they used. But they didn't want to, Henry Ford didn't want to just buy the rawhide from them, he wanted the part. So that's how they got into engineering. More and more things ended up having a shaft over time. So it's one of these parts that you don't know anything about until they fail. Hopefully they don't fail. But they're buried into anything that's got an engine or a shaft that's turning. So that was really how they got into that. And then eventually there was no rawhide in the product at all. It was actually rubber is what they used. They figured out how to mold rubber onto metal. And they had all sorts of patents along those lines and became the world's leading producer of oil seals.
And back then, that's a disruptive technology, right? That changed everything for Ford in terms of the ability to use the product and for the family to move and innovate, right? And so there's a lot of times when we think about disruptive technologies and innovating in businesses and how do you have product enhancements and how people anticipate or envision the world and then coming together to collaborate between businesses with new inventions that are out there. You step back, even rawhide can be innovated upon. Even buggy whips could be innovated upon.
Right.
And taking the business in a different direction because that part of the business no longer existed. Right. And these are the early days in Chicago.
Yeah, it was the original plant location was 20 East Ohio. So for people in Chicago, that's actually a pretty ritzy neighborhood now. Eventually, they ended up on Goose Island. There's a Morton Salt building is kind of a famous one if you're coming in the train from the northwest suburbs where we live, and that was the property that they owned. I'm pretty sure they picked that location because the rawhide. The raw material would be coming up the river from the stockyards, and they could process and do things along those lines originally there. Eventually, they moved throughout the country, kind of left downtown Chicago, had a big facility out in Elgin, which was where their world headquarters were, but they had plants all over the United States in lots of different places.
And you consider, in terms of the family wealth story, that being the first generation. Migrated to Chicago, here, starting the businesses, continuing to grow, evolve, adapt, and you consider yourself fifth generation at this point.
I would have been Gen 5 if I actually came to work for the company. I did not go into the business because about that time when I was getting out of school, I graduated from college in 1979. They had already decided to hire somebody to really build the business up to probably and possibly sell it because there were so many family members that owned shares of stock and things along those lines, and that to take it to the next level, they really felt they needed to actually sell the business.
And so from that process, so we went through the first 200 years really quickly, right? And then we got to the 1860s, and now we're into the 1970s. And so it's the business in the family continues to grow through the generations. You've got multiple family members now that have various ownership in different forms and functionality. Take us through that period of time and what transpired within the business.
Yeah, it's one of those cases where sometimes you just think everybody has the same life that you have. You make an assumption that that's kind of the way things are. And in our case, my father was in a family business, so he had a business. My mother's family had a business. Even the woman I married, Tammy's family, had a family business. So I thought everybody just had family businesses. That's what you did. Obviously, that's not the case, but that's kind of your assumption. There's all sorts of great things with family businesses, and there's also a lot of things that can be very trying with family businesses, especially when you get into generation like number 5 on my mom's side. Here's this business that's doing really well. They actually had 2 divisions. They had bought another company in the 1960s, a company called Safety Clean, which was recycled oil and had these this whole business of actually picking up oil and recycling it. And this is all before the EPA and before the mandate of the requirement of doing things like that, plus oil prices doubling during the Jimmy Carter era. So, we had kind of businesses that were just exploding, some due to to some extent, there's a lot of good planning that people do, but then there's a lot of luck that happens along the way too. The fact that oil prices, for example, doubled in that particular business, as well as there was a mandate that oil needed to be recycled. You couldn't just dump it into the field or down the drain. All very good things, but if you have a whole system in place to be able to take advantage of that, then you flourish. So
sometimes you can lead the disruptive technology, and sometimes being in the right place at the right time when all of a sudden a regulatory change comes to bear and you happen to be out in front of it.
Yeah, I joke that I always wanted to be on the leading edge of technology, not the bleeding edge. You can be too early for a lot of things, spend a lot of money, and then the technology ends up being not the right technology at the right time, and somebody else picks up what you had done 5 years later, 10 years later, and it's exactly what's needed. Fiber optics would be maybe an example of that, where leading people didn't do very well. People who kind of caught it in the middle did well, and now fiber optics are not nearly as big a thing. And timing is a big part of it. And you can plan for lots of different things, but some of it's luck, in my opinion. I mean, it's just God's grace that you were at the right place at the right time.
And so during that, roughly in the 70s, there was a go public event that took place within the family.
Two things happened. They decided to take the Safety Clean public, and they decided to sell the Chicago Rawhide outright. And they actually sold to the family that owned Fiat. At that particular time in Italy, they were worried about Italy going communist, and they wanted to make sure they were investing a couple $100 million a year outside of Italy, so that in case they had to run to the border, they had a place to go. Oil seals are used in automotive, as we talked about before, so it was an industry that would make sense for them to have a participation in. So we had kind of two liquidity events happen at the same time. One was anybody who had shares got the Chicago Rawhide shares. They got their money. The other thing that happened was they took Safety Clean public at the time, and you had to take 20% of your shares to make the market for it to go public. So kind of two things happened at the same time.
And if you had 75 family members at that point in time that had an interest in the business, as you said, a lot of people won the lottery that day when that happened.
Yeah, I got to watch my family win the lottery all at once, and for some of them, lottery winners, I think it's 85% of the people that win the lottery, if you talk to them 10 years later, they wish they had never won the lottery. I think that would be pretty close to the numbers that were within my family as well. For some of them, the problem is, I think when you get to Generation 5, sometimes they haven't been well prepared for what money is. My kids, I constantly am talking to them about, when they were younger, they're older now, is that you have to understand the difference between an asset and a liability. Because what most lottery winners do is they run out and they buy liabilities, and then they don't understand the cash flow that's required for them to actually be able to maintain that liability. So, houses, jet skis, all sorts of different things along those lines are really not things that are going to actually create wealth. They're actually something that they're going to have to be fed.
Right.
So that was
a lot of times within family businesses that family members very broadly look at it as monopoly money, right? It's the value of the asset. It's sometimes hard to reach. I wish every family business actually had a ticker symbol on their wall, so that the value, if something went wrong, it drops in value, it's back up, you're doing something good. It would drive everybody absolutely mad. I don't know why people do that when they watch the public markets and think that the world is different than within their own private businesses. But the aspect and the learnings that come from going public, actually, it just highlights it. You go from being asset rich and cash poor to now having cash and liquidity. And then the behaviors that come in, and then the lessons learned, where you have the concentration that develops the wealth, right, and the concentration that loses the wealth. that comes in from bad decisions. And there's an aspect, if I recall correctly, is there's a huge embedded gain, right? Because there was no basis for anybody in the positions that were there. And so some of that leveraging, some of that buying liability was actually buying that on margin, borrowing against the value of the security holding. Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, a little bit of the perfect storm that caused some problems were, so you get this one initial payout, and you're going to have to pay taxes on that initial payout. Cap gains was fairly high at that time. As you mentioned, the stock value went back to the original stock value in 1867 or whatever the start date was. So it was like 0.00001 cent a share or something like that for virtually 100% capital gains. And so you get this pile of money, you get a tax bill, you pay that, and then you go out and buy things with that money that's left over. It's kind of manna from heaven at that point. Now you start realizing that you have to feed some of these liabilities you bought, that new home, the second home, and the other things. And where the perfect storm that kind of happened was the people who did, they sold their 20% at the initial offering, but they held on to the stock, and Safety Clean stock actually broke a lot of records on Wall Street. It started at 20, came out at 20, it went up to like 50, 60 split, and it did it constantly, and it had the record quarters for double-digit increase in sales and double-digit increase in profitability. So their wealth advisors said, well, you don't really want to sell this stock because it keeps going through the roof. So they had pretty much a single concentration on stock. But we have this thing called margin, and you can borrow against your stock to be able to pull the money out and be able to do things like, buy gas for pay your taxes, do these other things without having to deal with the capital gains relating to that particular stock. And unfortunately, Safety Clean got taken over in a hostile takeover by Laidlaw Corporation, and then eventually they had over-leveraged. It was a big firm that was doing a lot of these leveraged buyouts, and they ended up going broke. So the
collateral goes away.
The collateral goes away. Now you still owe the money that you borrowed, and you don't have
assets.
You don't have the stock at all to be able to do it. So now you got to start selling all this other stuff, and it's a lot easier to increase your lifestyle than it is to decrease your lifestyle. And unfortunately, it caused problems within the family and things like that. So it was sad to watch. It had a really big impression on me. I was young. I actually sold all of my stock at the stock offering to actually go and buy my father's business, which was a steel company. He was in the steel industry. So I kind of took a different route. I went to business school, undergrad, and actually later went and got my MBA as well. And
so in that moment, to even go in that moment, because you've got
Sure.
70-some family members that are riding this rocket ship that just keeps going up, right? Living, buying all these sort of things. And there's I say it all the time, right? Don't let the tax tail wag the strategy dog, right? And so many people are sensitive to taxes, as am I, right? I mean, no one wants to pay more taxes than they absolutely have to. But at the same time, people can become so tax concerned, so tax fearful that they actually end up being blinded by their underlying strategy and what is it that they want to achieve and what's the objective and what's the purpose of the wealth. And yeah, you don't want to pay taxes, but for you looked at it and said, well, no, I've got a different plan for my life. I'm with a different business with your dad and how you think about the strategy. So you had to take that tax hit from liquidating to then turn around and take what was remaining after tax and go and buy the business. What was the rest of your family saying to you at that point in time when you were saying, yeah, I'm going to sell this and take my cash and go in a different direction?
Well, certainly short term, as they're watching that ticker tape, was actually something they literally did watch, and it kept going up and up and splitting, and they had more shares and everything. They were making way more money than I was, kind of plugging away in the steel industry, which is a lower margin, kind of tough tough business. And so, I kind of looked like the fool and I kind of was at that point. At least I felt that way. But I really loved what I was doing. I loved being in control of my own destiny, and I've always kind of liked working. I really found that to be really fun and a calling for me. So the thing that I had a professor that kind of talked about how most wealth in this country, when you think about the people that have, a lot of wealth, it was a single strategy that got them there. Mm-hmm. So that luck aspect of right time, right place, and you make all this money. The people who have lost massive amounts of money had a single strategy.
Right.
So when you get to the point where you have a lot of wealth, it's really important to take some of those chips off the table and actually spread them out in a diversified approach that I know Clearwater does with their clients, to say, now we're talking about wealth preservation as opposed to wealth generation.
Right.
There's wealth generation alongside it, but it's not taking this risk of, I'm going to bet all my money on black and roll the roulette wheel, because eventually something disrupts what you have.
Right.
And so that whole thing about diversification and how do you do it and what it looks like is very interesting to me. So that was kind of what I was trying to do to some extent.
Because we're not trying to win the lottery, right? I mean, you end up winning the lottery because that number turned up in that case by skill in terms of the family developing the business, by luck, right time, right place for where that business was, and then having the go public event. But then it is now that you're wealthy, how do you maintain that? How do you steward that? How do you manage that? So you took your chips off the table, paid a very large tax bill, which actually informed some things that you're doing today, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. And then you went and engaged your dad in his business to actually buy him out at the ripe old age of
28.
28. Okay.
I actually found the letter that I wrote him about basically demanding to buy the business from him, which I don't know where that came from. I had so much respect for my father and everything, and he was pretty much like, fine, you want to buy, here's the number. And later on, I came back to him. At that time, there was a phrase. Banks were really they were very behind these type of transactions, and they called them LBOs, leveraged buyouts, and they were a good thing. And so the banks were kind of saying, you should do these things. Mm-hmm. And so we did, and my dad kept saying, hey, it has to be an arm's length transaction. If it looks like you're getting too good of a deal, they'll disallow the sale. Now you have to go through appraisals. Back then, it was just kind of a smell test. Later, I ended up buying another business after I bought my father's to expand the business even more. And I joked with him that I had to buy another one because I got such a bad deal when I bought from him. I said, an arm's length transaction means you pay twice as much as what it's worth. He says, you were the one that wanted to buy the business. I wasn't necessarily wanting to sell. He was actually a little younger than I am now. So it's kind of funny. I sit there and I can't believe what I actually wrote to him. So, but anyways, that's kind of the way I did, and I wanted to create wealth. And again, here's the timing thing. I bought in 1990. The second business. 1990 was when basically the federal banking system decided that leveraged buyouts were not a good thing. They're a bad thing. They're a highly leveraged transaction. We don't want those on your
bank books.
On your bank books. So they wanted to get rid of those loans. And so I got to learn, and it was the start of a recession. 1990 was the start of a recession. So I've just levered up. I bought this, I thought the banks came in with me and they said, oh yeah, we love it. 2 months later, they don't love it. And you're only as strong as, if you're borrowing, you're only as strong as your bank's strength at that point. Yeah. And it was a real lesson for me. I really had to work very hard for a good 8-9 years to get to the point where we got kind of into a good cycle where I actually could possibly sell. And that's what I chose to do, pretty much because a lot of manufacturing in Chicago was leaving. Being in the steel business, not as much was being made here. Stuff was going overseas, and there was overcapacity. I felt like, okay, I might be the last guy to drown, but I'm going to drown. I'm going to look for an uptick. We cut a really good kind of 18-month period. I found one of my competitors. It was actually they were owned by the world's largest steel company at that time, and I was able to exit at the ripe old age of 41 to redeploy my assets and go in a different way.
Now, had you ever considered with the kids? You've got 4 children, two sons, 2 daughters. They're all married now, but earlier on, had you ever considered about, well, no, you're 5th generation in the family business that was created back in the 1860s. You need to keep this. Did you ever feel the pressure of needing to retain it in order for the next generation to be engaged versus saying, well, no, strategically, this asset no longer makes sense as part of the Pringle Inc. enterprise, right?
Yeah.
As you had said in one article. Did you ever feel that pressure, or no? It was about the business, and strategy dictated it was time to move on from this asset.
I mentioned that my wife Tammy, her family also was in a family business. Her brothers were Gen 3 in that family business, and her brother's actually still in the business, 105 years old. And just recently he sold out and Gen 4 didn't happen. But she really didn't like, she loved that they had the family business, but there was tension between, 3 brothers and just all they ever talked about was business at the dinner table, and I think she wasn't encouraging me to kind of save it for the next generation and have all that happen for another generation. And I felt like I wanted them to have find their own, path and their own calling and stuff. And I loved having them come to work and see me at work and stuff like that, and exposing them to it. Tell one quick funny story. My youngest son came, and it happened to be one of these times in the steel business that we were in, they have slitters and stamping lines and all this stuff. And he comes in, and he would always dress up. He'd always wear like a suit when he'd come in to the office. So it was kind of fun. And we go out on this little viewing platform, and all this equipment's out there. It's a 350,000 square foot building with trucks going in and out, and it's really loud. He's like, "Dad, what is that? What is that noise?" And I go, "That's profit being made." I go, "If it's quiet, you're just hearing overhead."
You just don't know.
And it's funny because he actually ended up going. He's the only one who ended up going to business school. He's actually a banker now, and married and has
still wearing a suit.
Himself.
Then still
wears a suit. But I just felt it was really important. We have 2 boys, 2 girls. Wanted each one of them to kind of find their own calling and their own passion, and it's been a blessing.
And to share a little bit about Tammy and her growing up, and and the siblings and all they talk about is business. When you talk about family business, it starts with family first, right?
Yeah.
And the businesses are tools within the family to achieve the family's objectives. So as you and Tammy would get together and be talking about these items of what you want the family to look like, what's important, how did that discussion evolve, knowing that you also have businesses that can actually be very consuming of time and even if not physical time, mind share, just in the preoccupation that would be there. How did that dialogue play out for you and Tammy?
Yeah, I think the discussion would have been different probably. Tammy's father passed away with cancer when she was I think she was getting ready to go into the 8th grade, 7th or 8th grade. And so then, the brothers are coming, some are still in college, coming into the business, trying to run the business, and the conflict, and is there really enough business there to support 3 families, and what does that look like, and what's fair, and while things had been laid out from a standpoint of what would happen, I think there's always, when that one generation that's kind of directing everybody and being a bit of the referee is no longer there, that's when things can fall apart. I think I know I've seen it with other families when you got this family and everybody's getting along great and everything, and then the patriarch and the matriarch pass away, and then all of a sudden, I don't know if it's human nature or whatever, but there's just some sort of fighting for different aspects of things, or this isn't fair, or you shouldn't get to do this, or you can't do that. And I think Tammy just really didn't want that to happen to us and to our family, and nor did I.
Right.
And it would have been different if the business was wildly profitable. We'd probably still be in the steel business to some extent if it wasn't something that was struggling a little bit and we needed to do something different.
Yeah, yeah. You received your MBA from a prestigious national institution, and yet there's things in business that you learn that's just called the street smarts of being in business, doing that. What is it within a family business that business school can never prepare you for?
I think the dynamics of that the family business is there every moment of your waking life. I think most people go home from a job and they'll even move from one job to another, and to some extent you can get into a job and within a family business to some extent. I've seen people get into it. It's clearly not a good fit for them, but they're making probably more money than they would anywhere else. So they've elevated their lifestyle to actually to kind of be with that family business, and then they can never really kind of figure out what they really would love to do. And I think that's a sad thing, because round hole, square peg type thing, you just never feel like this is really what I want to do, and I'm
where the
trapped,
identity gets tied into the business,
right,
versus the family having an identity to itself.
Right. When your last name is Schwinn or Wrigley or whatever, it's just kind of to some extent expected. And I've seen family members within that did not go into the business and actually have flourished in other aspects of things, and where the ones that's kind of stayed in the business didn't necessarily have the life that you or I would consider to be, fulfilling, and, just lots of problems with marriages and, divorces and just, I've said it a lot. I see a lot of people with lots of zeros after their names, and they're miserable, and we think money solves, I think society, culture thinks that money solves all problems. And that's really not true. I mean, the Bible kind of warns you about money more than anything. It can just become something that becomes your idol and becomes a problem. So you have to be really, really careful, really intentional about what you want to do, what you want to teach your kids, in my opinion. I've seen some families who do it really well, and I try to emulate those families. And
it's funny.
Some of them have a lot of money and some of them don't, but they do it really, really well.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you say that, because Melissa and I mean, we say it all the time. When we grow up, we want to be like Joe and Tammy, because we just love watching you.
Tammy, I understand me. I'm not so sure.
Well, I was being nice, Joe. Absolutely. And how you've approached things, because I think that word intentionality, there's intentionality within the family, there's intentionality about the business. The strategic nature of the business, when do you exit, how do you look at taxes, how do you plan, how do you think about your giving, your generosity. You want to come back to that in a little bit. But you and Tammy are also very intentional with your kids, your family, because generations have done it before. You were sharing a little bit earlier with your mom this past weekend. Well, you go ahead and share the story about the legacy that's been created, and still the experiences and the memories that are being created today.
Yeah, I just recently I had somebody talk about, there's all these different asset classes when you try and diversify your portfolio, and alternative assets are kind of a big thing. And I had somebody say to me, my summer home is probably the most important alternative asset I have from a family standpoint, and the old boat that we have that we go out on is one of the most important assets I have for creating legacy within my family. And because sometimes you can feel like, should I really have this, type of thing? Should I have this extra home, or should I have this? And this friend was arguing with me that he thinks it's some of the most important things we do that actually are very God-honoring, to make sure that our families are very close. We can have sacred times together. We can have discussions, and we can have those quiet moments to be able to actually impart some of the wisdom that the generations before us actually did. So the unique thing that we have is that original family member that came over in the 1860s bought a home up in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And so since the 1880s, we've had a place there. So I'm fifth generation on Lake Geneva. I have kids that are, sixth, and my grandchildren are now seventh generation on our property at the lake. And it's morphed into, really by my great-grandmother, there's 5 homes, 3 guest homes, and so it's all cousins and all this kind of stuff that are there, mainly from that Chicago rawhide money, and that's what it was. So my mother turned 94 on Saturday, and she's living in an assisted living facility, and she's definitely the matriarch of the family, but unfortunately she's developing some pretty severe dementia, and she's also got some cancer, and we didn't know if we'd be able to get her up for her birthday, and surprised her, picked her up, and did a day trip. It's really about the most that we could do in one day. But we get up there, and we kind of have a golf cart to be able to take her down to the pier and get her out with her walker. And I mean, I'll cherish this video forever of my mom walking out on the pier, and there's 18 of us that all kind of break into song of happy birthday, to her, and she's just blowing them kisses, and just kind of a great memory. And then had a great meal with her. She loves lemon. It was kind of a lemon themed meal, and she was just around that table, and all the grandkids and great-grandkids were all just kind of loving on her. So having that type of a tradition with family, that everybody really cares and everybody shows up, is can be fairly unique, because get pulled in a lot of different directions. But this was something nobody else was going to miss.
And she'd been going up there from the day she was
this
born.
was she went up when she was actually only 3 months old. So this was her 95th year in a row going to this house, going up to Lake Geneva, spending time there, and on the ride up, just asking her about stories of things that her grandmother, my great-grandmother, did for the family, and things that they wanted them to do. They all had to go to sailing school. They all had to do, a variety of different things. So just a lot of that history is something that I think it's great when you can have a family history that everybody knows the stories and can tell the stories.
And you wouldn't have that story if it wasn't for your great-great-grandparents, having that and making that decision, and then that asset being retained in the family. Doesn't mean it's true for all assets, but for that one, and retaining that and the special and the unique nature that it is. We all have 8 biological great-grandparents. So I encourage listeners now, even think about it. Everyone has 8 biological great-grandparents, and very few people can name all 8. Very few people can name half of 8. So within just a few generations, we lose track of our own family stories. And so to being able to have the stories that get created, the stories that get passed on, the stories that get learned and shared is so important when it comes to that legacy perpetuation, which isn't just about a business or a family business making it, a century or longer. It's about the stories that come into play. So when you think about this word legacy, how do you define that? How do you think about that for the future generations?
Yeah, I'm going to tell a quick story before that I think is kind of fun. My youngest daughter went to Medill for her master's in a broadcast, and she was a producer. And
so she's going to critique you and I on this thing completely then.
I don't know if I'll show her that, but it definitely will. She brought up one of her cameramen from WGN, where she was a producer, and she sat down with all of the living people in my mom's generation at that time, 4 years ago. And she had a set of questions, and she interviewed each one of them, and has created kind of this archive of the stories of the lake, which I think was great. The fun thing about it was, one of the stories that I've heard was that my great-great-grandfather won the house up in Lake Geneva in a card game. and that he actually had to, the guy said, well, you just won the house, you didn't win the lot. So in the winter, they actually picked the house up and put it on, basically built a big sled, and they pulled it by horses across the lake to a piece of property that he had bought. He bought 200 acres on the lake, and they put this house up on it. Great, fun story. One of the other family members tells the story that because we aren't on that original property, and we aren't there anymore. We're in a different part on the lake.
Okay.
That our great-great-grandfather lost the house in a card game in 1924, and that's why we moved to the new location
where
we're at now. So I don't know. I kind of like to believe that both stories are true. He must have been a heck of a gambler and up and down. But
so far we're talking about wealth management topics. We're hitting on winning the lottery, right, or gambling and playing cards and losing assets. Not approach we'd recommend to anyone. Right?
No, these are not. These are the don't do. These are the don't do things. Sometimes those are the. You ever notice when you get something wrong on a test? That's the one. That's the thing you remember.
Yeah.
You remember that. So
everyone likes to talk about the winners, but you learn from the losers.
You learn from the losers. But I guess what I would say is, from a legacy standpoint, that really, Tammy and I have always said to our kids, family first. We never. You would get in more trouble if you said to one of your siblings, like, use the word stupid or something like that. Anything to bring them down, because the world's going to be tough enough on them. We felt as a family, everybody's going to have to cover each other. They got their own, got your back. And so that kind of family first thing. After college, honestly, our kids ended up, one of the things, teaching them a little bit the art of the deal. It was in 2009, bought with them a 3-flat, and they ended up, over time, they ended up all living in that 3-flat and having their kids together, and they all live together with their spouses, and the fact that the spouses come in and love this as well. My wife and I got married on the property at Lake Geneva. All 4 of our kids got married on the property as well. So just those traditions and that style of doing family, what a blessing. What a blessing having other having these spouses come in and also embrace those traditions. So I think legacy is every generation. My hope is that my kids would improve upon what the generation before me modeled. How do we model what's the right things? How do we teach them to be good stewards? How do we teach them to follow where God's calling them? What does that look like? Have discussions about that. There's an awful lot of money spent every year on advertising to tell me and you and our children that they're not enough. And that if they just had one more thing, if they just purchased this, then they would be worthy. And that's just one of the greatest lies. But you're having to kind of fight that, because that's what they're being inundated with now with the phone. How many times are they being told that, if you just click on this or buy this or whatever, you're going to feel better, and it's going to make you happy, but it's not going to give you true joy.
All the happy but passing in the moment, and then you're onto the management of it, and over time, right? You accumulate. You accumulate country club memberships. You accumulate houses. You accumulate, and so we've been talking a little bit about Lake Geneva and the intentionality of that specific property. But there's a whole lot of other items that you had accumulated over time that you got to a point and you're like, what am I doing? And we need to start shedding and releasing some of these things, and the freedom you actually found through that process too. Can you share a little bit more about
absolutely. I definitely was an accumulator. I was definitely somebody that felt like the more I was following along with what society says if you're successful you need to do. And all of a sudden I got to the point where I was realizing that I was spending all my time maintaining this stuff. We had a home out in Telluride, Colorado. We had it for 25 years. It was awesome. A lot of great family memories and all sorts of other stories where we pull our kids out of school for the month of March and homeschool them, and we even lived out there for a year. And this is pre-internet days, so doing that was very radical. But trying to have every day be a memory, but you don't need stuff to do that, and then that stuff can actually detract from your ability to have fun. All the good stuff's free. I mean, my kids laugh at me because every night at the lake we have a really good view, and I'll be running out there with my phone taking pictures of the sunset and how it'll change as it moves to different ways, and I'll know if the clouds are off to the to this particular side, it's going to be kind of a fantastic sunset, and I'll set up another place, and they're like, you're going to have like a 10,000 page coffee table book at some point in time. But there's nothing that a man could make that would have anything that would be nearly as spectacular. There's no light show that could be as good as what we get kind of for free.
Yeah.
And I even like to get up in the morning and watch the sun rise because it's different light in a different way, and I love to do a lot of photographs of it. So, I didn't want to model to the kids that you needed to have lots of stuff to be happy. So we started shedding quite a bit of our things, and I still love to play golf. I still have one country club's plenty. Don't need three, And
it gets down to how you define what is a rich life. There's actually a book written years ago, Beyond Wealth, and it was just that redefining and saying, well, when was the last time you went for a walk on the beach? When was the last time you just enjoyed sitting and listening to some jazz, or having a glass of wine and relaxing and just taking in the sunset, right? Just taking in how you define what a rich life isn't about the level of assets, right, that are on the balance sheet. It is all these other things that you're experiencing, and the richness of the relationships and the family and the kids or grandkids, or it just that is the definition when you get into what is a rich life. And yet there's still responsibility then back in terms of the assets that you're managing. But if you can simplify, because you sold, right? I mean, at this point in time, you rent your place here, your dwelling here, because just like I'm done with managing and consuming my hours with management of the properties, and yet you select your intentionality and where you allocate that into. Yeah. And that really gets to how you and Tammy define what you want in that richness of life and what you want that legacy to be. Well, taking care of,
the lake property is something that even if that goes away, if there's some circumstances where we need that, and I'd prefer not to have to sell it off or anything like that. And we've definitely told the kids, hey, if there's a time, don't feel like you have to keep this going. Just like a family business, you don't have to keep the lake home going. It's there for a purpose, for a time frame, and it's just something that we get the blessing of being able to be a steward of, but eventually it might not be something that we should be a steward of anymore. Telluride became that, where we felt like we weren't being good stewards anymore. And that was kind of becoming our rubric. Are we using it? Are we a good stewards? Or should somebody else have the blessing of being able to use this particular property and, be able to be in the mountains? And so we kind of made that decision. We're going to get rid of this. We're going to get rid of this. We're going to get rid of this. And it's a lot to manage the lake. Just that alone. Right. We don't have a bevy of people that takes care of everything. We do have a lot of help, but. For example, one of our family traditions is every Memorial Day, everybody knows that we're going to be planting. The property's called Rainbow Point. It's famous kind of for its gardens, and it's been featured in quite a few at the lake magazines and stuff like that. And there's a shore path that walks around Lake Geneva. And we have people that when we're planting it, every year they're like, we love that you're out doing this. We know the story that you're doing it. It's such a blessing to everybody who walks by. This is our favorite garden on the lake, and all this kind of stuff. And it's hard work, but all year long when we walk down from the house to go to the pier, we get to see the fruits of our labor. Yeah. And different areas, different people kind of plant each year, and they, this is the area I did, and stuff
the
like
kids,
that.
The grandkids' involvement, right?
Oh yeah, they're running around, and they're digging now. The 6 and 7 year old, or 5 and 6 year olds are actually, they're definitely planting, and they're a part of it. So again, that's kind of the legacy. Games at night instead of and robust discussions and laughter and things that you just don't generally get to do
Right.
if you're in your own house, there's other things that you have to do. So having this place to congregate has been great.
And when you use the word being stewards and stewardship multiple times, how do you define what that is? How do you define what stewardship is?
For me, it took a long time to get to this point personally, but really just recognizing that we don't own any of it. We really don't. We get to be stewards of these things for our lifetime, and how do we take care of it? How do we pass on the love of it? And then just doing, to some extent, doing the right thing all the time. I have a breath prayer that's, God, help me be your light, or Jesus, help me be your light, or Holy Spirit, help me be your light. Those, that's what my true hope is, that when people interact with me, they see something that maybe is a little bit different, and that they're drawn to the one that's I'm trying to emulate.
And so one thing we haven't talked about, that a lot of listeners are hearing the story of the family business, the trajectory, the enjoyment for your family, but we haven't talked yet about generosity and what it means to be a light in the world and also resource different activities. And your family is extremely generous, and yet you're very intentional with a focus that you bring into your giving. Can you expand on how you think about the stewardship from the lens of generosity and giving and philanthropy?
Rainbow Point, where this Lake Geneva is very matriarchal. And my great-grandmother, who I didn't know, was actually was challenged by Jane Addams and the Hull House, and there was a lot of things that they did with generosity along those lines in Chicago, and then creating space for people to come out of the city in the summer to be able to come up and enjoy Lake Geneva like our family was able to do. My mom was a teacher, always a servant. Very hard to serve her. She doesn't like that, but she loves to be a servant. So I think those things were modeled within the family, and trying to continue that to some extent. At our church, we heard about a school down in the inner city called Holy Family, and that church had started a school called Holy Family School, and it had come out of Cabrini Green, and it bounced around the city, and we went down to take a look at it with the family, and it's now almost 30 years we've been supporting this school, and eventually went on the board of it. We did a capital campaign, and we raised the money to actually build a school in North Lawndale so we could have a permanent home, because they didn't have one. It now supports between before school, after school, summer programs, around 650 kids kind of run through the program, traditionally in an area that's underserved. So it's a really good Christian education in a beautiful, brand new building.
Yeah.
If you asked my kids now what the family business is, they would probably say that. All of them have been mentors there. My oldest daughter became a teacher, I think, because of volunteering there. It's kind of cool. My oldest son just went onto the board. I'd kind of gone off the board probably about 6-7 years ago, still involved, and he just went onto the board as well. So everybody, and all of the spouses actually were mentors and a part of it. Yeah. So that's, I think, you're asking about legacy. I think of all the legacies, that would be probably the thing I'm the most proud of.
The life change of people that you may never directly even know, and yet you've been resourced to make a difference, and being very intentional, very focused. We were talking about it a little bit earlier, right? Good giving is hard to do. The discernment about that, it is, you have to take it with the same intentionality that you do the business, right? Do you sell the steel, company because things are changing, and how you look at the way various charitable entities are run, and how you're approaching and the giving that's there. And you and I talked about the great wealth transfer that's continuing just from baby boomers and a lot of family businesses. And there's so much work that needs to be done when it comes to estate strategy in preserving assets within families, whether this strategy still makes sense, the generations are still engaged, or how that wealth doesn't just get diluted away over time, or doesn't get poor decision making taking place. So how that plays out in families, and to incorporate the philanthropic discussion, right? And I use philanthropy in with that stewardship, right? Because it is brotherly love, philos and anthropos, loving mankind. How do we love our neighbor as ourselves? How do we become that light in the world? And the way that we do that, well, for a lot of individuals, it could be with the resources that they have at their disposal, that they can turn around and be able to focus and give the way that you had. But they've got to be intentional about it, right? They've got to sit down and actually be thoughtful about that approach, and then committed for the long haul, as you've also been, for 30 years to influence, to give not just of the writing a check, but of your time and talent too, being on the board, being alongside, knowing how those assets are actually playing themselves out.
Yeah. To some extent, when you have the money, writing a check is the easiest thing to do. It's when you actually get involved and get in relationship. Yeah. That's where the biggest blessings have been, is, communities and kind of people groups that I typically wouldn't have been able to have much exposure to just because of where I lived and where I was kind of hanging out. I really got to have very good, deep relationships with individuals that I never would have, and I think it was a blessing for both sides to really understand. Oh wow, you have problems too. I thought that you have money, so you're not going to have any problems, right? And just doing life together has been just such a blessing in that particular regard. In that particular regard, there was one other thing I was going to say, but it's escaped me.
You and I first met. I was chairing the advisory board for the National Christian Foundation here in Chicago. As part of the governance board, we were restructuring the affiliate. And through the search process of working with National and how that was playing itself out, I was sitting down in Boca Raton. You and I got connected. We had a call and talking through, do you take this role? And that was 2017, as I recall, and taking this on. So you don't need to be working, right? But you're coming alongside individuals in the complexity that they have. Talk a little bit about the work you're doing now, because we joke, right? You're working harder than you've ever worked at this point in time. And
I've never had anything be more rewarding. I didn't expect at 60 years old, I'll be 66 next week. I didn't expect at 60 to make a career change. I always really loved talking about the stewardship piece and the generosity piece and the opportunities relating to that. And so lo and behold, this job comes about. I didn't really know much about the National Christian Foundation, to be honest with you. So getting to learn more about it, I had a friend where I was working who said he had heard about the opening. He said, I think you should apply for it. And I'm like, well, he's one of the founders of the company. I guess I'm supposed to go look at this. And I joke with him about it because it's just such a blessing that he did. And then he kind of said, well, I think God's telling me to tell you about this. And I'm like, and now he's throwing the God card in. I actually do have to go look at it. And I was really kind of more on a glide pattern towards kind of retiring. And what a huge blessing it is to, at 60, to kind of, the story of Esther in the Bible is about, you were born for just such a time as this. To think that all of the positive things that happened to me, as well as the negative things that happened to me, and my family with wealth and just my background in business and all these things would prepare me to just do this job really, really well. And I remember having this moment where, everything else that I've done to this point was really is for this. And it's just been a blast watching it. Generosity is actually in a really big growth mode. It's like a venture capital type thing. It's explosive growth, 10x. Since we've been there, since I've been here, and I'm not taking credit for this. This is just kind of what's happening. But, we went as an organization from $1 billion to almost $4 billion in 6 years. Our expectation is over the next 8 to 10 years, we'll have a 10x growth over that. So we're talking $40 billion on an annual
per
basis.
year received into
a donor advised funds for people to be able to give out to the charities that they care about.
So really quick, can you explain for everyone that may not be familiar with what's a donor advised fund and the NCF platform?
Sure. Yeah, and I didn't know about it, and I'm actually shocked at how many people don't know about it. I don't like being the best kept secret, so hopefully this will help. Donor advised funds, if you think of having a charitable checking account. So the NCF is a 501c3, so we're a charity, and when you put money into a donor advised fund, it's like having all these separate checking accounts, and you get your donation deduction at that time. And the money goes into there, and then you can give it out to the different charities in a more kind of controlled atmosphere. I have a son who's an attorney, and at the end of the year, they get their bonus, and you kind of figure out, oh gosh, I got a tithe, or I want to do whatever I want to do as far as charity, and you got to write all these checks, and it's December 31st, and you're trying to get them in the mail, and sometimes it can be a little haphazard and not as strategic, and maybe not as joyful as, I'll write one check to the National Christian Foundation.
Right.
It goes in there, and then I can now schedule out, I want this to go to my church every 2 weeks. I want this to go to Holy Family School on a monthly basis. And it's just a really, really nice way to be intentional and strategic with your giving. And there's ways to actually be able to do it in a tax-efficient manner. If you take and you actually, instead of putting cash into your account, you can use appreciated assets that have embedded tax liability and gains associated.
Well, and then we go back to like the unrealized capital gains. How do you manage unrealized gains? Well, you can gift it all, right, or part of it, or a share, or a unit, and avoid the capital gains realization and get the full fair market value deduction going into the donor advised fund, and then selling it inside of the donor advised fund. Then you don't have the capital gains tax, and now you've got that liquidity to give to the end charity. Yeah. And when people think about is it donor advised funds, or is it a private foundation or a supporting organization, other things, and there's people that have multiple tools, right? They are tools to be used to fulfill the need. And we've got individuals that we work with that have multiple aspects because there's different applications.
Yeah, the interesting thing is the analogy that I've heard that I really like is if you're going to go off-roading, you don't use your sports car to go on a mountain train. You need different tools for different things experiences you want to have, and each one of those things that you talked about they're great for different reasons. You just want to make sure you're using the right vehicle for the right trip that you want to go on. Right. And that's what we help out with.
And with the assets that are out there, and especially looking at entrepreneurs and businesses that they've created, and they have this, most of them have very little basis in it, right? It's all capital gain, that their approach of giving of the business, it doesn't just have to be a unrealized gain on a stock position or a fund position. It can actually be the business or the real estate that could be gifted into the donor advised fund. Correct? I mean, there's a lot.
Absolutely. I'm the poster child for how not to do it. For example, when one of the reasons we sold the house in Telluride was we didn't feel like we were good stewards anymore. One of the things we wanted to do was support the capital campaign for the new building. We had the home that we had for 25 years had appreciated in a great way, and we were going to have some of that money we were going to keep for ourselves, and some of that money was going to go to the school. Well, if I had donated my portion of that home in Telluride before the sale, the capital gains that was associated with that piece was about $300,000. $300,000 more would have gone to the school, as opposed to actually paying taxes on the gain. Right. So
other lessons learned over life.
Another lesson learned, when I sold my business, when I sold the steel business, similar thing. You sell your business and you have a party and you're happy. Right. And but
The biggest check you ever written?
April 15th, you still get a knock on the door, and you are going to give to a not-for-profit, and it can be the federal government, or it can be one that you maybe choose to have for yourself. And to this day, the biggest check I've ever written in my life was to the federal government.
Yeah, and that's what I call involuntary philanthropy, right? You have to, you got to pay every dime that's due, but if you would have structured things differently, as you know now, you can eliminate that and get different deductions. Yeah. And this is, one of the encouragement. And then we're going to close and wrap up. But I said it last week too, and I'm like, I'm going to have to start doing dual episodes because there's so much, Joe, that I appreciate from you and your perspective and your wisdom, and your life experience as you've navigated what you've done within your family. It's encouraged and inspired me. It's challenged me and Melissa, and even the way that we engage our family. But there's so many items that you've highlighted where a lot of people look, it's like after the liquidity event, I need to get these things organized, right? I'm growing the business, it's like, well, no, there's so many items, so many discussions that you should be having earlier on. When it comes into, well, what about succession? Is family in it or not in it? Has strategy shifted? How does that play out within the estate structure? What does it mean with estate taxes at the federal level and at the state level, right? Because we're sitting here in Illinois, but how different states approach their death taxes come into play. How you structure and organize and be that voluntary philanthropist, be that voluntary that discussion needs to take place and build over years to get to the point of even having the liquidity events versus saying after the liquidity event, I'm too busy with work, I'm too busy with the business, I'll figure this out after the fact. Well, at that point in time, the kids may be grown and gone, and something else has happened in life, or you're writing really very big tax bills. And we haven't met anybody yet that wants to pay more in taxes. So how do you minimize that? You have to bring intentionality. I mean, that's the key word of the intentionality in everything you do, with your family memories, to the business and the way that you run it and how you're approaching it too. So if you have just closing thoughts, wrapping up, encouragement, that aspect of individuals going, if I knew what I knew now 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 10 years ago, what would be those items for the listeners that you'd want to leave?
Well, I think one of the things that if you have children, and I've heard some people say, we don't let our kids know that we have money, and they have no idea what's coming their way. And, their plan is that upon their death, there's going to be this pile of money that they have to kind of deal with on a personal level, and then maybe they've even set something up for them to do. They're going to have some charitable accounts that they're going to have them give away the money. I've seen when that's happened, it doesn't go over very well with the next generation. And you have such an opportunity during your lifetime where you could set up some donor-advised funds as a family, and you fund it, and you have some meetings with them, and you talk about values and what is important and what would you like to do. You can teach them about investing money. You can teach them about the difference between an asset and a liability, which we touched upon. And during your lifetime, they're going to learn how to manage money that they can't use for themselves. And I think that's a really, really good starting point to learn all these things about how to kind of deal with money and how to deal with working with an advisor and figuring out these things, having family meetings, going through. And in that way, my hope would be our children will know our values before they get our valuables. And that would be the legacy that I would want is, okay, why are we giving to the school down in the city? Why are we doing the things that we're doing? What are the faces of those people? What are the outcomes that have happened? Over 30 years, the blessing is we've gotten to see so many different things that, God's kind of revealed. It's really God's work. And, for us and our family, that's our belief. And to be able to see that happen and kind of see how you have to change things. Originally, the first scholarship we did, it was $295 for a scholarship for the year. It's now over $15,000 for a scholarship to provide for them what is needed, and the technology and all the things that we brought out. But God's put all those people together. We've been able to do it. We've been able to grow the school. Been extremely blessed, and I think, to me, that would be the thing that I would just recommend for people to do. intentional and do it early and involve your family and talk.
Yeah.
Figure out communication.
Yeah.
And bring somebody in like yourself to actually help. I've seen you do it with other families. I know you had Kenny Cox on, and the way you've engaged them and that family, and how Kenny has done that, I think is just kind of incredible. How he knows he needs to bring in some, these experts to really help him navigate where he's been blessed.
Yeah. But appreciate that, Joe. Again, you encourage me, you inspire me. Love the people we have the opportunity to serve, and to be able to do that and do that together. With you, the National Christian Foundation, the team, and doing life so that people can make the wisest decisions for themselves. All things considered, right? From the legal and the tax side of it, bringing in the right experts there, along with what we do and with what you're doing. And you don't just do it and you don't just speak about it, but you live it, and that's inspiring to me too. So thank you so much for spending the time with us today, and wish you just God's blessings on everything in the future.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.